There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They are the Tuesdays that feel like any other Tuesday, the quiet evenings that promise nothing more than the gentle turning of a page or the low hum of a refrigerator. You don't recognize them as thresholds. There is no ornate framing, no celestial announcement. It is only in looking back that you see the hinge, the exact point where the path you were on bent so sharply that it became an entirely new road. For me, that moment was not a grand collision of fate, but a quiet question hanging in the air of my hallway, illuminated by the single, weak bulb I always meant to replace. It was the question of a door, slightly ajar, and what it meant to close it. Julian was asleep on my couch again. From where I stood, leaning against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, I could see the faint rise and fall of his shoulders under the heavy quilt I had draped over him an hour before. The television was off. The city outside had finally quieted its manic pulse, and the only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall and the soft, even cadence of his breathing. It was a sound that had become a new kind of baseline in my apartment, a rhythm that had woven itself into the fabric of my evenings. His presence was a weight, a warmth, a solid thing in the fluid uncertainty of my life. For 3 months, my home had become his harbor, and my couch, his bed. I had performed this ritual countless times. I would check that the heat was set correctly, that a glass of water was on the coffee table for when he inevitably woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. I would gather his discarded jacket from the arm of a chair, fold it with a reverence I would never admit to, and place it beside his shoes, which were always kicked off with a kind of weary abandon near the entrance. These were the small, unspoken acts of care that defined the strange, new territory of our friendship. They were gestures that lived in the liminal space between platonic concern and something deeper, something I had spent years pretending did not exist. But tonight was different. Tonight, the door to my bedroom, which was just past the living room at the end of the short hall, was not closed. I always closed it. It was a boundary, a silent affirmation of the lines we did not cross. It was the physical manifestation of the space I kept between my reality and my longing. I would retreat behind that door, lie in my own bed, and listen to the sound of him sleeping just a room away, a universe of unspoken feelings separating us. But tonight, in my exhaustion after a long day, I had forgotten. I had walked out after getting him the quilt and left it open, just a sliver, a dark vertical line against the soft lamplight of the hall. And there, in the quiet of my apartment at 2 in the morning, that sliver of darkness felt like a confession. It felt like an invitation I had not consciously extended. To close it now would feel like a retraction, a sudden, deliberate reinforcement of a wall he had been slowly, perhaps unknowingly, dismantling for weeks. It would be a definitive statement, this far and no further. You sleep there, and I sleep here. We are friends, and that is all. But to leave it open, what did that mean? Did it mean anything at all? It was just a door, a simple, mundane slab of painted wood. But in the charged silence of my home, a silence filled with the weight of everything we had never said, it felt like the most significant object in the world. It was a choice, and I stood there, paralyzed by its unexpected gravity. The story of us, of what we were becoming, felt as if it hinged on this one, simple, ridiculous action. To understand the weight of that door, you have to understand the foundation on which our friendship was built. Julian and I met in a way that felt like the opening scene of a film, a cliché made real by the slick, glittering streets of a city caught in a sudden summer downpour. We had both been at a concert for some indie band that was enjoying a brief, fleeting moment of fame. I went alone because I preferred it that way. Photography had taught me the value of solitary observation, of experiencing the world through my own lens without the filter of someone else's commentary. Julian, I would later learn, was supposed to meet friends who had bailed at the last minute, leaving him adrift in a sea of strangers. When the final encore faded and the crowd spilled out onto the pavement, the sky opened up. It was a theatrical, almost violent deluge, turning the warm evening air cold in an instant. People scattered, a frantic explosion of umbrellas and pulled-up hoods. I found myself pressed under the narrow canvas awning of a closed bookstore, watching the rain bounce off the asphalt like handfuls of thrown diamonds. And then he was there, squeezing in beside me, shaking water from his dark hair and laughing. It was the laugh that I noticed first. It was not a sound of frustration at the weather, but one of genuine amusement, as if the universe had just told him a private, hilarious joke. He was drenched, his thin t-shirt clinging to his frame, but he seemed to radiate a warmth that defied the sudden chill. He turned to me, his eyes a startling shade of green, and said something about the band's questionable choice for a closing song. I, who rarely spoke to strangers, found myself agreeing, and just like that, a conversation began. It was easy. That was the most remarkable thing. Talking to him felt less like an introduction and more like a continuation of a dialogue we had been having for years. We discovered we lived only a few blocks from each other, a coincidence that felt like a small nudge from fate. He pointed to a corner store across the street, its neon sign bleeding into the wet darkness. "I'm making a run for it," he declared, "for the crappiest, most overpriced umbrella in human history. Care to join the expedition?" I heard myself say yes before I had even fully processed the question. We ran, laughing as the cold rain plastered our clothes to our skin, and emerged moments later with a flimsy, bright yellow umbrella that was barely large enough for one person, let alone two. The walk home was a clumsy ballet of huddled shoulders and jostled elbows as we tried to share the meager shelter of the umbrella. He held it, his arm around my shoulders to keep me tucked in close, a casual gesture of functional intimacy that sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through me. We talked about everything and nothing. Our jobs, the city, bad movies, the way the streetlights fractured through the rain-streaked plastic of our temporary roof. His energy was a current, pulling me along in its wake. I was typically a quiet observer, a man who lived behind a camera lens, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. But with Julian, I felt present. I felt seen. When we reached my building, we stood for a moment under the relative dryness of the entrance, the sound of the storm a dull roar around us. "Well," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. This was the best part of the concert. He gave my shoulder a final squeeze before jogging off down the street, leaving me with the ridiculous yellow umbrella and the lingering warmth of his proximity. Our friendship grew from that rainy night, rapidly and with a certainty that felt elemental. We were, in many ways, perfect opposites. He was kinetic energy, a whirlwind of plans and people and projects. He was a software consultant, a job that sent him flying across the country to solve problems for companies with a confidence that I found both baffling and deeply admirable. He moved through the world as if it were a space designed for him, taking up room with an unapologetic ease. I, on the other hand, was a creature of stillness. As a freelance photographer, my days were governed by the slow, patient pursuit of light. I found my meaning in quiet moments, in the subtle architecture of a shadow, the fleeting expression on a stranger's face. My apartment was my sanctuary, a calm, ordered space filled with books and prints and the scent of darkroom chemicals. Julian seemed to find a kind of gravitational pull in my quiet. He would call me after a draining week of meetings in another city and say, "I need to decompress. Can I come borrow some of your silence?" He would sprawl on my floor, surrounded by my contact sheets, and tell me about the absurdities of corporate life, the sterile hotel rooms, the endless parade of beige conference centers. I, in turn, found myself drawn out of my shell by his vibrancy. He would drag me to gallery openings I would have been too intimidated to attend alone, introduce me to his sprawling network of friends with a proud, "This is Leo, he's a genius," and make me feel, for the first time, like my quiet work had a place in the loud, spinning world. We were two different climates that, when brought together, created a new kind of weather, a perfect, temperate balance that nourished us both. For 3 years, this was the shape of our world. He was my best friend, my anchor, the one person I could call at any hour for any reason. The platonic nature of our bond was a given, an unspoken truth. He dated, mostly a series of bright, ambitious women who seemed like good matches for his energy. I listened to stories of their relationships, offered advice when asked, and played the part of the supportive, detached friend with an actor's discipline. Because somewhere in the first year of our friendship, in a moment I can pinpoint with photographic clarity, I had realized that my feelings for him had breached the walls of friendship and flooded into a territory that was both beautiful and terrifying. We were at a small Italian restaurant, one of his favorites, celebrating a new contract he had landed. The table was small, the room was loud, and a single candle flickered between us. He was telling a story, his hands gesturing wildly, his face animated with joy. The candlelight caught the green in his eyes and carved his features into a landscape of warm light and soft shadow. He looked like a Caravaggio painting, all dramatic intensity and effortless beauty. And in that instant, a single, devastating thought bloomed in my mind. I love you. It was not a thought I invited. It was an intruder, a truth that had slipped past my defenses. The force of it knocked the air from my lungs. I felt a vertiginous drop, as if the floor had fallen away, and all that was left was the terrifying, exhilarating freefall of this new knowledge. I did what I had always done when faced with overwhelming emotion. I contained it. I built a room for it in the architecture of my mind, a hidden, soundproof chamber where this love could exist without ever touching the real world. I furnished it with stolen glances, with the memory of his laughter, with the casual touches that meant everything to me and nothing to him. I became the curator of a secret museum dedicated to Julian. Protecting our friendship became my primary directive. The thought of losing him, of making him uncomfortable, of shattering the easy intimacy we shared, was unbearable. So I locked the door to that room and threw away the key. My love for him became a quiet, constant ache, a background radiation I learned to live with. I was the quiet observer, the steadfast friend. It was a role I had accepted, a penance for a feeling I could not control. And for years, it was enough. The shift began, as such things often do, with an ending. Julian had been dating Chloe for nearly 2 years. She was a lawyer, sharp and witty, and, from my perspective, permanently exhausted by the sheer force of Julian's personality. Their relationship had always seemed to me like a mismatched rhythm, his frantic, allegro tempo clashing with her more measured adagio. I had watched him try to reshape himself to fit her world, sanding down his exuberantly rough edges, tempering his spontaneity. He seemed smaller in her presence, his light dimmed. The breakup, when it came, was not a surprise, but its aftermath was a demolition. It was not a clean break, but a messy, protracted collapse that left Julian emotionally gutted. He showed up at my door late one night, looking like a ship that had been dashed against the rocks. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out. He did not speak at first, simply walked past me into the living room and sank onto my couch, burying his face in his hands. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with a pain I could feel in my own chest. I did not ask what happened. I just made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to for me, a simple, warm offering against the coldness of the world. He drank it without a word, his hands trembling slightly around the mug. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. She said I was too much, he whispered to the floor. And not enough. All at the same time. That was the beginning of the new season in our friendship. My apartment, once a place for him to decompress from the pressures of work, became his sanctuary from the wreckage of his life. He was unmoored, adrift in a sea of his own failure and confusion. The life he had been so carefully constructing with Chloe, the plans for moving in together, the shared friends, the imagined future, had been razed to the ground. He was left standing in the rubble, and he did not know how to rebuild. He started spending most of his evenings with me. We would order takeout, watch old movies, or just sit in comfortable silence while I edited photos, and he scrolled aimlessly through his phone. He was seeking refuge not just from his empty apartment, but from himself. I watched him navigate his grief with a painful, aching tenderness. He was trying so hard to be okay, to project the easy confidence that was his trademark, but I could see the cracks in the facade. I saw it in the way his laughter never quite reached his eyes, in the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin, in the new and unsettling stillness that had replaced his usual kinetic buzz. He was a vibrant, sprawling city that had fallen into a sudden, bewildering blackout. My role was simple: to be a steady presence, a source of light in the darkness. I did not offer platitudes or easy solutions. I just offered my time, my silence, my unwavering belief that he would find his way back to himself. I kept the door to my secret room firmly locked, terrified that any hint of my true feelings would feel like a predatory advantage in his moment of vulnerability. It was during this period that the lines began to blur, not through any grand declaration, but through the slow, creeping erosion of physical boundaries. It started innocently enough. He fell asleep on my couch one night in the middle of a film. It was a deep, exhausted sleep, the kind that comes after a long battle. I did not have the heart to wake him. I gently lifted his legs onto the cushions, took off his shoes, and covered him with a quilt. It felt natural, a simple act of care. I went to my own bed, the closed door of familiar comfort, and listened to him breathe until I fell asleep myself. But then it happened again, and again. It became a pattern, an unspoken agreement. He would come over, we would eat, and by the end of the evening, he would be asleep. He started leaving a change of clothes and a toothbrush in my bathroom, small acts of domestic colonization that I observed with a racing heart. "It's just easier," he said with a shrug, avoiding my eyes. "If that's okay." I told him, of course it was okay. My apartment became his home base, his recharging station, his safe house. The couch was no longer my couch. It was his bed. I tried to see it as nothing more than what it was, my friend needing a place to land. I told myself that my feelings were coloring the situation, that I was projecting a narrative onto a series of perfectly logical, platonic events. But it was getting harder and harder to believe my own rationalizations. The ritual, as I came to call it in my mind, was the heart of this strange new era. It was the centerpiece of our evenings, a quiet drama that played out on the soft, worn cushions of my sofa. It was a ritual of proximity, of unspoken need, and it was slowly, methodically driving me insane. It had evolved from him simply falling asleep on the couch to something far more intimate, far more ambiguous. The first time it happened, it felt like an earthquake. We were watching some forgettable action movie, sitting on opposite ends of the couch as we usually did, a respectable and safe distance between us. Julian was quiet, his gaze fixed on the screen, but clearly a million miles away. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a low, anxious hum. Then, in a move that seemed both unconscious and deeply intentional, he shifted. He stretched out his legs, swung them over my lap, and settled back against the cushions. My entire body went rigid. His weight on my legs was a sudden, shocking intimacy. I could feel the warmth of him through his jeans, the solidness of his bones. I held my breath, waiting for him to realize what he had done and pull back, maybe with an awkward laugh and an apology. But he did not. He just lay there, his eyes still on the screen, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The movie played on, a meaningless cacophony of explosions and car chases, but I could not register any of it. My entire universe had shrunk to the point of contact between our bodies. I was hyper-aware of every tiny shift of his weight, every soft exhale. I sat there, a statue of feigned nonchalance, while a storm raged inside me. That night broke a seal. The unspoken rule of personal space had been breached, and once breached, it could not be easily restored. The next time we watched a movie, he did not wait. He simply laid down and put his head in my lap, curling into a comma shape on the couch. He closed his eyes, and within minutes, his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I looked down at him, at the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, at the peaceful, unguarded expression on his face, and my heart felt like it was tearing in two. One half was filled with a pure, agonizing love for this man, a desperate desire to card my fingers through his hair, to trace the line of his jaw. The other half was screaming with anxiety, a frantic litany of warnings. This means nothing. He's just tired. He's grieving. Don't misread this. Don't ruin this. So I did nothing. I became an expert in stillness. I would sit for hours, my own muscles cramping, my own needs forgotten, just to provide him this small measure of comfort. I was his pillow, his anchor, his living security blanket. And the ritual grew. It became our default setting. He would arrive, shed the armor of his day, and gravitate toward the couch, toward me. Sometimes he would talk, his voice muffled as he spoke into the cushions beside my leg. He would tell me about his frustrations with work, his lingering sadness over Chloe, his feeling of being adrift. And I would listen, my hand resting near his head, the urge to touch him a physical ache. More often than not, he would just fall silent, letting the quiet of the room and my presence soothe him into sleep. I began to study him with the intensity of a scholar examining a sacred text. I memorized the map of freckles across his nose. I learned the difference between his tired breathing and his deep sleep breathing. I knew the exact spot behind his ear where his hair was softest, a fact I had discovered accidentally when my hand brushed against it one evening. Each of these details was a precious, painful piece of data that I stored in the secret museum in my mind. I lived in a state of constant, heightened awareness. My apartment, my sanctuary, had become a minefield of intimacy. Every surface held the potential for a casual touch that would send my pulse skyrocketing. The air itself felt charged, thick with all the words we were not saying. Was he aware of what he was doing? That was the question that haunted me, the central mystery I was trying to solve. Was this a conscious, deliberate move towards something more, or was I just a convenient, warm body, a safe and sexless source of comfort in a time of crisis? His plausible deniability was perfect. He was always tired, always stressed. He could always claim that he had simply fallen asleep, that the physical closeness was an accident of exhaustion. He never acknowledged it. The next morning, he would be his usual self, all bright energy and friendly chatter as we made coffee, as if he had not spent the previous night curled up against me like a lover. This duality was a form of psychological torture. It gave me everything I had ever wanted and nothing at all at once. It was a hope so potent it was poisonous, and I was drinking it down every single night. I tried, once, to gently re-establish the boundary. One evening, as he started to settle into his usual position, I shifted slightly, moving more toward the edge of the cushion. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but he noticed. He paused, his head hovering over my lap. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of something in his eyes. It was not anger or confusion. It looked like hurt, a deep, wounded vulnerability that made my stomach clench. He said nothing, just quietly moved back to his side of the couch, pulling his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around them. He stared at the television, but his posture was closed off, defensive. The space between us on the couch felt like a vast, frozen chasm. The silence was not comfortable. It was tense and miserable. I had never felt more alone. After 20 minutes of this unbearable quiet, I gave in. I reached out and gently nudged his shoulder. He looked at me, his expression questioning. I just patted my lap. The relief that washed over his face was so immediate, so palpable, that it broke my heart. He unfolded himself and settled back into his familiar place, letting out a long, slow sigh as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. In that moment, I knew that I was trapped. I could not deny him this comfort, even if it was destroying me. And so the ritual continued, night after night. It was our dance, our unspoken language. It was a beautiful, tender, and excruciating state of being. I was living in the pages of a story I desperately wanted to be true, but I was terrified to turn to the final chapter to find out if it was a romance or a tragedy. The tension was building, a static charge accumulating in the small space of my living room. I knew, with a growing sense of dread and anticipation, that something had to break. The ambiguity was a fragile vessel, and it was beginning to crack under the pressure of so much unspoken feeling. We were heading toward a threshold, and I did not know what we would find on the other side. The crossing came on a Friday. It had been a long week for both of us. I had been on a difficult shoot, and Julian had been dealing with a demanding client who was, in his words, Sucking the very marrow from my bones, he arrived at my apartment looking utterly defeated. He barely spoke, just dropped his bag by the door, stripped off his jacket, and collapsed onto the couch. I did not even suggest a movie. I just put on some quiet, ambient music, dimmed the lights, and sat down beside him. He immediately shifted, folding himself against me, his head resting on my chest. His arm came around my waist, holding on with a quiet desperation. It was the most contact we had ever shared, the most explicit his need for closeness had ever been. I rested my cheek on the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and the faint, clean smell of his skin. My arm went around his shoulders, holding him securely. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in unison. The music washed over us, and the city hummed its distant lullaby outside the window. In that moment, the anxiety fell away. The frantic internal monologue went quiet. There was just this, the solid, warm weight of him against me, the steady beat of his heart under my hand. It felt right. It felt like coming home. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that this, whatever it was real. Hours seemed to pass. The music had long since ended, and the room was steeped in a deep, comfortable silence. I thought he was asleep. His breathing was even, his body completely relaxed against mine. I was starting to feel drowsy myself, my eyelids heavy. I was on the verge of drifting off when he moved. It was a small shift, but it was enough to bring me back to full awareness. He pushed himself up slowly, propping himself on one elbow so he could look at me. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could see the soft, serious expression in his eyes. They were wide, searching my face for something. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. This was it. This was the moment the universe had been bending toward for months. I could feel the shift in the very atoms of the room. He was going to say something. He was going to break the spell, for better or for worse. I held my breath. Leo. His voice was a whisper, a rough, hesitant sound that was so unlike his usual confident tone. It was the sound of pure vulnerability. I could not find my own voice. I just looked at him, trying to convey all the things I could not say with my eyes alone. He swallowed, his gaze never leaving mine. He seemed to be having an internal battle, a war between impulse and fear. Then, he took another shallow breath, as if steeling himself. Would it be? He stopped, his voice catching. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again, his expression resolute. Would it be okay? The question hung between us, impossibly heavy. Would it be okay? He did not say what it was, but he did not have to. We both knew. The air crackled with the unspoken word, kiss. It was a question that offered me an escape route. I could pretend not to understand. I could laugh it off, make a joke, deflect, and retreat to the safety of our friendship. I could say no. The entire fragile ecosystem of our relationship, all my years of carefully guarded feelings, all the agonizing hope of the last few months, it all came down to this single, binary choice. Yes or no. Risk everything or risk nothing. My mind was a whiteout of panic and longing. 1,000 possible futures flashed before my eyes. The future where I said no, where we awkwardly retreated and our friendship became a ghost, haunted by this moment. The future where I said yes, and it was a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled confusion for him that would shatter us permanently. And the future where I said yes, and it was right. The future where this unbearable tension was finally released, where the subtext became text. It was the future I had dreamed of in the secret, locked room of my heart for years. It was the most terrifying and beautiful possibility I had ever faced. He was still looking at me, waiting. The vulnerability in his eyes was a plea. He had taken the biggest risk, laying his defenses down completely. He had given me all the power. And looking at him, at his tired, hopeful, frightened face, I knew I could not turn him away. I could not protect myself at the cost of his heart. I still could not speak. The word was lodged in my throat. So I gave him the only answer I could manage. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us. The kiss was not what I had imagined. In my dreams, it had always been something desperate, passionate, a release of years of pent-up feeling. But this was something else entirely. It was unbelievably soft. It was tentative, questioning. It was his lips barely brushing against mine, a gentle, hesitant pressure. It was not a kiss of desire, but of confession. It was a quiet admission of a need he could not articulate in any other way. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a door swinging silently open. He pulled back slowly, his eyes fluttering open to meet mine. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. We just stayed there, faces close, breathing the same air, caught in the profound, shimmering aftermath. The question had been asked, and the answer had been given. A line had been crossed, irrevocably. We were in a new country now, and we had no map. In the quiet darkness of my living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our old friendship, we simply looked at each other, terrified and hopeful and utterly, completely changed. The aftermath began not with a bang, but with a vanishing. When I woke the next morning, the sun slanting through the blinds, the apartment was silent. The quilt was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. The indentation of his head was still visible on the cushion, a faint ghost of his presence. But Julian was gone. I walked through the quiet rooms, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. His shoes were gone from the entryway. His jacket was missing. In the bathroom, his toothbrush was gone. He had erased himself from my space, quietly and completely, like a thief in the night. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A single text message from him. Hey, had to get an early start on some work stuff. Rushed out. Talk later. I read the words over and over, dissecting them with the frantic energy of a cryptographer. Work stuff. Rushed out. Talk later. It was so casual, so brutally, devastatingly normal. There was no mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us just hours before. It was a flimsy, transparent excuse, a dismissal. It felt like he had woken up, seen the wreckage of our shared vulnerability in the harsh light of day, and fled the scene of the crime. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest the night before withered and died, turning to ash in my throat. Talk later was a lie. He did not call. He did not text again. My own messages to him over the next 2 days, a casual, hope work is going okay, followed by a more direct, everything all right, were met with short, evasive replies. Swamped. Crazy week. Catch up soon. The excuses were a wall he was building between us, brick by painful brick. He was avoiding me. He was retreating, pulling back so fast and so far that I felt a kind of emotional whiplash. The intimacy we had shared felt like a hallucination, a dream I had woken from to find myself utterly alone in the cold reality of my apartment. The pain of it was a physical thing. It was a hollow ache in my chest, a constant, low-grade nausea. I had been so careful for so long. I had guarded our friendship, prioritized his comfort and his well-being above my own feelings for years. And for what? To have him initiate a moment of earth-shattering intimacy only to recoil from it in horror? It felt cruel. It felt like he had opened that locked door in my heart, taken one look inside at the mess of my feelings, and slammed it shut in my face. I felt foolish. I had allowed myself to hope, and that hope had been a catastrophic miscalculation. I had misread everything. The ritual, the closeness, the kiss. It had all been a product of his grief and loneliness, a temporary balm he had mistaken for something real. And I, the lovesick idiot, had been a willing participant in my own heartbreak. The silence stretched for 4 days. For days of me pacing my apartment, which now felt cavernously empty. The couch seemed to mock me, a silent monument to my stupidity. Every corner of my home was haunted by him. I replayed the kiss 1,000 times in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I imagined the tenderness, the vulnerability in his eyes? Or was I just that desperate to see it? The not knowing was the worst part. The ambiguity that had once been a source of thrilling tension was now an instrument of torture. I felt suspended in a state of agonizing uncertainty, unable to move forward, unable to go back. On the fifth day, I could not take it anymore. The passive waiting was corroding me from the inside out. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake so I could begin the long, painful process of rebuilding my walls and forgetting this had ever happened. I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear, and I walked the few blocks to his apartment. I had no plan, no speech prepared. I was operating on pure, raw instinct. I needed to see his face. I needed to break the silence. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I almost turned back. It would be easier to let it fade, to let our friendship die a quiet, unspoken death. But I thought of the man who had huddled under a cheap yellow umbrella with me in the rain, the man who had trusted me with his grief, the man whose head had rested so trustingly in my lap. I owed it to that friendship, to him, and to myself, to demand the dignity of an explanation. I took a deep breath and knocked. I heard shuffling from inside, then the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, peering out at me. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 2 days ago. His apartment, which was usually a bit cluttered but full of life, was dark behind him, and I could see a pile of takeout containers on the table in the entryway. He looked at me, and his expression was not one of annoyance, but of a cornered, exhausted animal. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "We need to talk, Julian," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "You can't just disappear," he sighed, a long, weary exhalation, and ran a hand through his messy hair. He did not meet my eyes. "It's not a good time, I don't care," I said, a surge of frustration cutting through my fear. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me and then treat me like a stranger. You owe me more than that." The words hung in the air between us, stark and unavoidable. He flinched, as if I had physically struck him. For a moment, I thought he was going to close the door. Instead, he sagged against the frame, his resistance crumbling. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound, miserable confusion. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he mumbled, turning and walking back into the gloom of his apartment. I followed him in and closed the door behind me. The air inside was stale. He did not turn on any lights. He just went to his own sofa and collapsed onto it, mirroring the way he used to collapse onto mine. But here, in his own space, he looked small and lost. I remained standing, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I could not seem to relax. "I'm sorry," he said to the floor. "I've been a coward." "Why, Julian?" I asked, the question raw with all the pain of the last 5 days. "What happened?" He was silent for a long time, his head in his hands. I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Because it felt right," he whispered, and his voice broke on the last word. "That's what happened. I kissed you, and it was the first thing that's felt completely, terrifyingly right in months. Maybe ever." I stared at him, my anger dissolving into a wave of bewildered empathy. This was not the rejection I had braced myself for. This was something far more complicated. "Then why did you run?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Because I got scared," he said, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping him. "I woke up the next morning on your couch, and the sun was coming up, and all I could think about was what we'd done. And I panicked. My entire life, Leo, I've had this blueprint. You know? Go to school, get the job, meet the girl, build the life. Chloe was part of that blueprint. And when that fell apart, I was lost. But you were never part of that plan. You're my best friend. You're the one constant, solid thing in my life." He stood up and began to pace the small room, his movements agitated, his words tumbling out in a rush. "And then I kiss you, and it feels more real than anything I had with her. That comfort I felt, sleeping on your couch, it wasn't just about being sad about Chloe. It was about you. It was always about you. I didn't let myself see it. And that terrifies me. What does that mean? Who am I, if this blueprint I've been following is completely wrong?" I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I didn't know how to jump. So I ran. I ran because I was afraid of what it would mean for you, and for me, and for us. I was afraid of ruining the most important thing in my entire life. He finally stopped pacing and stood in front of me, his expression raw and pleading. I am so sorry, Leo. I hurt you. I know I did. I was just so lost in my own fear that I couldn't see past it. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and I saw past the charisma and the confidence. I saw the confused, lonely man who had sought refuge in my quiet apartment. I saw the fear that was warring with a feeling he did not understand. And my own fear, my own hurt, began to recede, replaced by a deep, familiar wave of affection. He had not run from me. He had run from himself. I took a step forward, closing the space between us. I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were cold. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face, his eyes wide with a fragile, dawning hope. "You're an idiot," I said, and a small, watery smile touched my lips. A tear he had been holding back finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. "I know," he whispered. "We're both idiots," I amended, "and we can be scared together. You don't have to figure it all out right now, Julian. We can just start here." "Okay." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost visible washed over him. He squeezed my hand, a silent thank you, a silent promise. The silence in the room was no longer tense or painful. It was a space for healing, a quiet ground where we could finally begin to build something new, something honest, on the foundation of everything we had always been to each other. We had crossed a line, stumbled in the aftermath, and now, standing in the dim light of his messy apartment, we had found our way back to the start of a new road, ready to walk it together. The foundation of what came next was built not on grand pronouncements or passionate declarations, but on quiet actions and a shared, deliberate honesty. We did not fall into an easy, conventional relationship overnight. The blueprint Julian had spoken of was gone, and we were left to draw our own map, navigating by the tentative, flickering light of this new, acknowledged feeling between us. It was a process of careful rediscovery, of learning how to be with each other in this new context. We started over, in a way, but we started from a place of profound, pre-existing love. He stayed at his own apartment for a while, a decision we wordlessly agreed was for the best. We needed to dismantle the old ritual, with its painful ambiguity, before we could build a new one. We needed to choose to be together, not fall together out of habit or convenience. So we went on dates. It felt strange and almost comically formal at first. I would pick him up, we would go to dinner, and we would talk with a kind of focused intensity we never had before. We were excavating our own histories, sharing the parts of ourselves we had kept hidden behind the comfortable facade of our friendship. I told him about the exact moment in the Italian restaurant when I knew I loved him. He listened, his expression a mixture of wonder and regret, and then he told me that my apartment had been the only place he'd felt truly safe and at peace for years, long before his breakup with Chloe. He just hadn't had the language to understand what that peace meant. The physical intimacy returned slowly, cautiously, like a shy animal emerging from hiding. It began with holding hands while walking down the street, a simple, public act of connection that felt both revolutionary and perfectly natural. Then came the first kiss that was not born of desperation or confusion. We were standing outside my building, saying goodnight after a long, meandering walk through the city. He turned to me, a soft smile on his face, and simply said, "Can I?" And I said, "Yes." It was gentle and sure, a question and its answer all at once, a promise of a new kind of quiet. Slowly, he started leaving things at my apartment again. But this time, it was different. His toothbrush appeared next to mine not as a tool of convenience for a friend crashing over, but as a statement of intent. He brought over a few of his favorite books to put on my shelves, their spines a welcome intrusion among my own. Each small item was a step, a deliberate merging of our lives. The couch, once a symbol of our painful ambiguity, became a place of intentional closeness. We would still watch movies, but now when he curled up against me, It was not a desperate search for comfort, but a confident act of affection. My hand would find its way into his hair without hesitation, and his arm would rest around my waist with a sense of belonging. The ritual had been transformed. What was once a source of deep anxiety for me was now a source of profound peace. The day he officially moved in, there was no ceremony. He just showed up one Saturday with 2 suitcases and a box of his most essential belongings. "I think my lease is about to become a very expensive storage unit," he said with a grin, dropping the bags in the entryway where his shoes had so often been kicked off in the past. We spent the day making room for him, clearing out a drawer in my dresser, making space in my closet. It was a quiet, domestic ballet, a physical manifestation of the emotional space we had already cleared for each other in our lives. That night, for the first time, we went to my bedroom together. The door that had once been such a potent symbol of our separation, the boundary I had stood before, paralyzed by indecision, was now just a door. We closed it behind us, not to keep one of us out, but to keep the world out, to create a private, shared sanctuary. Lying in bed, with him asleep beside me, his arm draped over my chest, his slow, even breathing the only sound in the darkness, I felt a sense of rightness so complete it was almost overwhelming. The ache of longing that had been my constant companion for years was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady warmth, a feeling of being finally, wholly, home. We found our rhythm. Mornings were for quiet coffee, a shared, silent ritual before the day began. Evenings were for shedding the day, for sharing stories, for the simple, profound comfort of each other's presence. We learned the landscape of each other's moods, the subtle cues that signaled stress or joy. I learned that he hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when he was truly content. He learned that I organized my bookshelves by color when I was feeling anxious. We were not just lovers. We were cartographers, mapping the deepest territories of each other's souls. The love that I had kept locked away for so long was finally out in the light, and far from being a destructive force, it was a source of healing for both of us. He began to find his old light again, but it was different now, steadier, less frantic, anchored by the certainty of being loved for exactly who he was. One rainy Sunday afternoon, months later, we were curled up on the couch, wrapped in the same heavy quilt I had once draped over him when he was just my friend sleeping in my living room. We were reading. The only sounds the soft rustle of turning pages and the drumming of the rain against the window panes, a gentle echo of the night we first met. He put his book down and looked at me, his green eyes soft and clear. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I used to think home was a place you had to build, with blueprints and plans and the right materials." He shifted, tucking his head into the familiar space on my shoulder. "But it's not. It's not a place at all." He tightened his arm around me. "It's this. Just this." And in that moment, I thought back to the beginning, to the concert in the downpour, to the years of quiet, hidden affection, to the agonizing tension of the ritual on the couch, and finally, to that moment of crisis and confession in his dark apartment. I thought of all the doors, both real and metaphorical, that had stood between us. The ones we had kept closed out of fear, and the ones we had finally found the courage to walk through together. We build our lives out of moments, stacking them one on top of the other like stones, creating a shelter against the storms of the world. Some are ordinary, forgettable, but others are thresholds, moments that change the architecture of our entire existence. Finding Julian, and finding our way to this quiet, honest love, was not about building something new from a plan. It was about recognizing that we had been building it all along, in every shared silence, in every act of care, in every unspoken truth. We had not built a house. We had found a harbor, and we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together.